Thanks, Helen, and thank you, Ahmet, Uncle Ahmet, for having me. It's a great honour to be addressing you, and as Helen says, we live in interesting times, to paraphrase the old Chinese proverb. I think I'm just going to dive straight into it. What we planned is I'll just give a little introduction to the accidental backseat I've had to the way the world has changed since 2004, and then Helen and I are going to dive into a conversation, and then we'll open it up for questions. And if you're lucky, we'll play some clips along the way. I want to start with two very interesting quotes. My PhD thesis was on the confluence between deceptive documentary making techniques and those of three other professional dissemblers: the propagandist, the con artist, and the magician. So this third documentary I'm making is really part of a secret trilogy, not that Australia's film critics could be remotely interested, but anyway. The first quote I want to give you was written by a propaganda scholar in 1927, Laswell, and he said, "Propaganda is the war of ideas on ideas." The second quote I want to give you, and both of these I think are going to resonate throughout our conversation, is by the resident stemwinder in America, linguist Noam Chomsky, who said that the blunderbuss to fascism is what propaganda is to democracy. So, since 2004, when I made Helen's War about my aunt, Dr. Helen Caldicott, single-handedly trying to stop George Bush's regime illegally invading Iraq, I've had an accidental front seat to the elevation of the state-sponsored lie in Western democracy from an aberration that can bring down governments, think Nixon and Watergate, to daily clickbait in the 24-hour news cycle, thanks to Trump, who incidentally Chomsky has warned us to ignore, that Trump is a distraction from what America's really up to. So that's another thing to think about. And just as to explain this front seat that I had accidentally, I want to start with Helen's War, in which we followed Helen trying to get herself locked up in Guantanamo Bay at the same time that Bush had said you're for us or against us, through to the WMD hoax, which was one of the great cons of the 21st century, perhaps the first, when Colin Powell stood up in the UN with his little vial of, what was it? That thing that he said was proof that Saddam had, WMD. I went from that to Forbidden Lies, accidentally I should say, but I think there's a through line here. I'm very interested in injustice and the perpetration of cliches in the West against other countries that we other. Forbidden Lies was about a hoax author called Norma Curie, who claimed to be a Jordanian virgin on the run from Islamic extremists for a book she'd written, a true story about the honour killing of her best friend in Jordan, but was in fact a Chicago con artist, one of the best alive today, according to the cops I interviewed in Chicago, on the run from the FBI for $10 million worth of fraud. And Norma Curie came here, courtesy of the Australian government, which is known to lock up Muslim refugees on site overseas, and was given an access all areas, courtesy Australian asylum, at Bribey Island, even though the Australian government knew she was actually married and the mother of 2 kids from Chicago. Go figure. With the backing of Dick Cheney's straight daughter Elizabeth, who was working in the State Department at the time. I then went on, accidentally again, to make a film about North Korean propaganda filmmakers. But what I was really doing in that film was comparing the green spin that we get in the West from coal seam gas mining companies with the old school Soviet-style propaganda that North Korean filmmakers still make today. So that film, yes, it's very odd. No one's ever combined coal seam gas and Kim Jong-il in the same sentence before, let alone the same movie. But that movie is really all about propaganda, and once again, don't believe everything you're told. And it ended with a film that Helen kindly talked about that came out in 2016, which was once again an accidental backseat to the rise of our most famous, I don't think favourite's the right word, notorious, alt-right populist, now Senator Pauline Hanson. In which, once again, I followed how she and others like her have harnessed social media to perpetuate misinformation or disinformation that enables them to keep their support base fearful, full of hate, and loyal to them. So through all these films, I've watched the rise of social media as a primary news source for voters, from what was ostensibly the first social media influenced election in the West, which was 2008 with Obama, to what was the social media dominated election in 2016 of Donald Trump. And if you watch the excellent documentary on Netflix right now, The Great Hack, you will see exactly how Cambridge Analytica was involved in getting Trump into power. Propaganda and manipulation, and this is where I think we need to start thinking about this. That's always been used to win elections. That's nothing new. You know, we've done this long before video came along. But what's different is the truth is now a commodity to be bought and sold in the information age, regardless of whether or not it is in fact truth. Truth has jumped the shark, okay? It's secondary, it's of secondary importance, and we all know this, the erosion of respect for facts, the bias silos, the new wave of fake news. And we will talk about this a bit later because my research is all about it. But the next wave, and be prepared because it's going to heavily influence the 2020 election in America, is fake videos. So watch out. Finally, I just want to end with a kind of provocation. We talk about left and right, you know, progressives and conservatives. This is an old dichotomy that we're always talking about, but it strikes me that there's a new one at play now. And it would be worth us thinking about the world in this context, in late capitalism, really. And that's the new dialectic for me, is that of humanitarians versus profiteers. And right now the profiteers are winning. They're winning because they don't care about using lies to get where they need to be, whether it's to plunder resources, win elections, take away our human rights. There is some hope here, and hopefully we'll get into it. But right now, I feel that my job tonight is to just inform you and engage with you, and maybe by the end of it, we can walk out with some armaments against what is to come.
Fantastic. Well, let's get into it. We're going to unpack your documentaries in a moment, and we do have some clips that we can show. But I want to begin with what's at stake: democracy. I've just spent 5 weeks in Greece, you know, the birthplace of democracy. But the democracy we have these days does not resemble the democracy of Pericles and the ancient Greeks. First of all, it's a side issue, but women weren't allowed to vote, slaves weren't allowed to vote. But what did happen is that there was a concern about letting just anybody vote. Okay, so Socrates basically said voting in an election is a skill, not a random intuition, and like any skill, it needs to be taught systematically to people. Letting the citizenry vote without an education is irresponsible. Now, I wonder what he would have said in the internet age. Manipulation in democracy is going to be the end of democracy. Can I get you to just reflect on that? Democracy and social media and the internet age, does one cancel out the other? I mean, how does democracy work when you are able to manipulate people, and people who are voting for parties that are not going to do anything for them? How does that happen? It's a big question, I know.
It's a wonderful question, and the Greeks certainly didn't have to contend with Kim Kardashian and Facebook when they invented democracy. I think that there's nothing more outrageous than an outrageous, and nothing more seductive than an outrageous lie. And the perfect platform for the outrageous lie is social media. I mean, back when Mark Twain said, the truth is still pulling on its britches when a lie travels halfway around the world, that's just on steroids now, thanks to social media. I think what we're living in now, and if you look at what Cambridge Analytica did, both with Brexit and the Trump election, is we're living with ever-increasing minorities that are ever easier to pinpoint thanks to data and data-gathering technology. And they are known as the persuadables. And when you're persuading people, you're using age-old propaganda techniques that, frankly, the West and the Eastern Bloc have been perfecting since World War I. And those techniques have not changed. I know there's a mathematician in the room who was talking before about the use of statistics.
UTS, yes.
Yeah, the use of statistics to promote certain arguments. And I mean, that's absolutely on point. That is exactly what's happening. And I have a checklist of 9 techniques that are used in propaganda and have been used in propaganda since World War I right through to the present. The difference is our delivery systems are far more persuadable and sophisticated and emotionally powerful than they were back when we were doing little fake news items in newspapers. And to sum them up very quickly, they're repetition. So think of the Trump crooked Hillary line that was repeated again and again on the American primary propaganda channel Fox News. Using statements, not arguments, and preferably emotional statements, something that the Nazis perfected under Goebbels, but then again, look at Trump talking about we're going to drain the swamp. Exaggeration and stereotypes. Think of Norma Curie's fake book, Forbidden Love, which exaggerated the idea of the evil, two-dimensional Arab man and the poor put upon victimised Arab women at a time when it was convenient for Western readers to have such a simplistic view of the Middle East while America was preparing to invade. In other words, dehumanise the enemy, see women as victims, and as George Bush said at the time, we're going to go in there and liberate their women. The fourth propaganda technique, which is used across the board from Michael Moore, who's arguably propagandist for the left, and Fox News, is be consistent, stay on message. Fox News, once again, remember the famous flip-flop thing that they repeated again and again to discredit Al Gore? Wonderful documentary called Outfoxed by Greenwald, that sums that up. The fifth technique, which all filmmakers use, myself included, in order to persuade people to think and feel about a thing differently, is humour. And if you go back to the very first mashup, the Lambeth Walk in World War II, where an English filmmaker took shots of goose-stepping Nazis, rewound them, and then set them to a popular pop tune at the time, and that went that decade's equivalent of viral, and it was played in cinemas all over England to make people laugh at the Nazis. That's a very powerful weapon. Then look at Kim Jong-il versus Hulk Hogan, back before Trump was calling the North Korea a legitimate government, back when America was calling it the part of the axis of evil. You had a proliferation of videos online talking about Kim Jong-il and sending him up as this kind of pop icon with tall boots and big hair, a figure of fun, when he was actually anything but. He was a very skillful manipulator. The sixth strategy is rumours. Hillary, the Pizzagate affair, use rumours, spread them, put them into the veins of the internet, watch them grow. The sixth is use statistics to back your argument. Think of all the anti-climate change deniers and all these stats we get deluged with about how, oh, but there were ice ages before, and look at how much it's actually only gone up a little. Barrage them with statistics. Eighth, entertain, do not be boring, the propagandist's number one sin. And finally, the biggest propaganda technique of all that continues to be used today from all sides of any given argument in the media and in the social media and in the Twitter sphere and in the netscape that is our current reality, is lie. Lie. Lie by omission or lie directly. Hitler first said that you can, a lie needs to be repeated 1,000 times before it can be seen as the truth. Bush in 2005 in a little reported speech said, in my line of work you've got to kind of repeat things over and over and over to catapult the propaganda. So those are the techniques. Now, what's the future of democracy? We're no longer in a democracy where Thomas Jefferson's quote, and in an informed democracy a voter will vote in a responsible fashion. Unfortunately, we're no longer informed. We're disinformed. We're also apathetic. So for every 100 fake videos that you're going to start to see online, there's only one scholar out there or one researcher trying to work out a technique to stop the proliferation of fake videos. We're apathetic. We will watch these things, whether or not they're true. We may even know they're not true. But if they confirm our biases, we'll click and share. I don't know that I can be that positive about whether democracies is working, but at the same time, let me play devil's advocate. Are we in a democracy? Corporations really own our governments. So really, isn't it just a myth anyway?
You mentioned Cambridge Analytica. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with Cambridge Analytica. So it was a company that dissolved, but you tell me it's back in action. It was if you have access to Netflix, watch The Great Hack, or go to the Four Corners website. About a year ago, they had an expose on Cambridge Analytica. It's a company that went out to governments, maybe in Eastern Europe, lots of different governments, and said, you want to win an election? You employ us and we can help you. So what ammunition did they have? Fake news, disinformation. But it got even worse than that. If you have a candidate who's really, really good, we can frame him. We can actually send a prostitute to his room, and then we can send a photographer. Yes, this is actually on the record. These are the services that it offered. Okay, so this is what democracy is actually up against, which is very, very serious. Let's talk about a little bit about deep fakes, because I know you've got a video.
Yeah.
Can we show the deep fake video?
Yeah, so Mikhail, just let me just set this up for a minute, but the clip that we're going to play in a minute is clip number 1. But let me just explain. So deepfake technology, which is of great interest to filmmakers, started on a platform called Reddit as an underground way of sticking the face of your favourite celebrity onto the body of a porn star in a porn movie. So people were circulating, oh, isn't this cool, Scarlett Johansson on all fours in this porn video, right? It was actually very sophisticated technology. Now that technology has now been taken to the point where they can take a leading figure like you're about to see with Obama and make him say something totally different, and yet it looks like he's saying it. And the reason I want to play this to you is you're going to see more and more of these in your social media feeds, and these are what is potentially going to influence the outcome of the 2020 US presidential elections. So can you please play it? Thank you.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or, how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. That's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources. It may sound basic, but how we move forward in the age of information is going to be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become some kind of fucked up dystopia. Thank you. And stay woke, bitches.
So just so you know, there are very, very few government-backed or private sector-backed labs that are trying to counter this deepfake technology. There is one run by Hani Farid at UCLA in Berkeley. He started as a forensic video analyst in crime scenes, and he's now developed his technology to be able to date stamp fake videos. In other words, check the authenticity of the camera it was shot on, or indeed if it's AI generated. So what you just saw is AI generated. But what he said recently in the Washington Post, I think it was as recent as 2 weeks ago, is right now we're being outgunned. So for every 100 fake news, disseminators using this new video technology. There's only one researcher trying to invent ways to stop it. The Pentagon's also onto it, but their interest is fake videos coming out of ISIS and other enemies of the state. It's scary times.
So yes, so this is what we will be facing in the future, and how do we fight it? Now, let's just for a moment look at our election, our recent election. So we didn't actually have a deep fake with Shorten saying, "I will introduce death taxes." However, everybody believed that would be the case. So I'm just wondering, do you think we have a traditional media? The traditional media is supposed to work on behalf of all of us. Let's leave social media out of it. As someone who's actually worked outside of traditional media as a freelancer and has done amazing work, what do you think? Do you think the role of our traditional media, have they been living up to the promise? Have they actually held people to account in the way they should have? Or have they actually moved a little bit too close? There is too much of a symbiotic relationship between politicians. I'm talking about the political journalists.
Yeah, the political class. Look, there's no doubt that the so-called mainstream media in Australia has shifted irrevocably to the right since Hanson first gave her "We're Being Swamped by Asians" maiden speech in 1996. I think we're very lucky in Australia to still have what's left of the ABC. We're unique in the Western democratic world to have this broadcaster. However, you're absolutely right. Anyone you know, and you'd know them, and I have colleagues there, would know that the ABC is increasingly cowed by the government of the time, and sadly it is a conservative government, and we only have to look at the cuts to the ABC since Abbott first promised not to cut the ABC to see what's happening there. I think that in terms of our recent election, you actually can't ignore social media. So sure, the mainstream media and the political class, and this is perhaps going to your point about are they too in bed with Canberra, were talking about Nick Xenophon at the time as the golden ticket, the independent that was going to get in. And in fact, I was the only documentary crew following Hanson. Everyone thought she was a one-trick pony going nowhere. And I was there filming her at a Reclaim Australia rally in Rockhampton in 2015 and saw with my own eyes Australians genuflecting in front of her, crying, getting her to sign their posters from 96. And I realised that this woman was probably going to get back in. And what struck me at the time was no one in the political class, media or commentators were saying this. And the reason I'm raising this is because Hanson got in because she flew under the radar. Literally, of course, in her little bespoke Jabiru two-seater flown by James Ashby, her pilot cum spin doctor, but also figuratively. She flew under the radar by speaking direct to voters through social media. She bypassed the mainstream media. The mainstream media didn't care what she was saying anyway, but if they'd bothered to want a press release, Ashby wouldn't have given them one. He would have said, go to the Pauline Hanson's Please Explain Facebook page, which the media ended up having to do when they realised that Hanson was a growing phenomenon. So the final thing to this story is that when she finally got in and the gobsmacked ABC deigned to give her an interview, and Trump then got in about 2 months later, and I remember the ABC interviewing Hanson after she'd had her champagne toasting Trump because she identified with him. She was draining the billabong, he was draining the swamp. And the ABC said to her, "You're just like Trump, aren't you?" And she said, "No, I'm not. He's just like me. I was doing what Trump was doing 20 years ago." And it's true. Did you know that in 1997, Pauline Hanson was Australia's first cyber politician? She was the first politician to get a web page and email her voters directly. So she's been doing it from the beginning. Bypass the status quo, which includes the mainstream media. Talk direct to your voters, and you've got a populist through line. It's a recipe for success.
Just taking on that point about Pauline Hanson and the mainstream media who look down at her, is it a problem, do you think, that the mainstream media is too middle class? We don't have enough working class journalists who actually perhaps come from some of the suburbs, that Pauline Hanson got plenty of votes from, that if you look at the last election, you know, franking credits, and these were mainstream issues, and poverty and inequality weren't looked at in detail. Is it a problem that the mainstream media is to, shall we say, upper tier, she would say?
Look, I think it's absolutely true that the mainstream media is in bed with the status quo. It's part of the political system. It's a symbiotic relationship. I think the point to make about Hanson is that she could have just as easily been a left-wing populist and got in, as being what she is, which is a right-wing populist, because the constituents she's really talking to are the disgruntled victims of globalisation, which was started by Keating and Hawke. But really, that's her bellwether, rusted-on voter constituency. The people who feel left behind by those bureaucrats in Canberra. And I think that, yes, there is an elitism in the Australian media, but journalists like Margot Kingston brilliantly tried to subvert that the first time round, and I tried to do it the second time round. And I can tell you, when I was talking to Hanson voters, they're kind-hearted people. They just need, if we're talking about persuadables, they just need persuading in a different direction to what Hanson was doing. The other thing is scratch the surface of any Australian family, no matter what ethnicity actually, and you'll find an aunt who's just like Hanson in the mix somewhere. You know, the relative who goes, oh, well, you know, she's not all bad. I kind of agree with some of the things she says. But I think we should talk about, let's give you a good news story for a minute. So there's Hanson, she gets in, you know, now arguably Hanson Mark II is more powerful, more sophisticated, and more politically savvy than Hanson Mark I ever was. And indeed just kiboshed the latest attempt to, what was it, a royal inquiry into something, and she shot it dead. Oh yeah, that dodgy thing the Environment Minister's just done. Anyway, our film's about to go to air, and in it, SBS had taken a clip, just a 2 to 3, very short clip, featuring a scene from the film where she talks to a cameraman. And they'd put it online 24 hours before the film was meant to air, and the clip went viral, reaching 2.4 million viewers in 2 days. Hanson was livid and beside herself because for the first time, the Hanson's Please Explain Facebook page was being barraged by negative comments from Hanson voters, saying, Pauline, why did you say such a stupid thing? What have you done? We don't support you, right? SBS rings us, James Ashby rang me, I've still got the message in my phone saying if you don't pull the clip, something terrible will happen. I then call the SBS commissioning editor, Saturday night, we're about to go to air, saying we've just had this. He says that's a real threat. He goes to the defamation lawyers. Is this defamatory? Should we pull it? Can she injunct the program? Now I'm just going to play you the clip and then I'll tell you the outcome of what the lawyers said. So, Mikhail, can you please play clip 4? So this is the clip that Hanson got up in a lather about, the one that went viral, and I want you to think about why it went viral. It's a very short clip.
30 seconds.
It's my favourite topic. Refugees. You're not going to tell me you're a refugee, James, are you?
No, Aboriginal.
Really? I wouldn't have picked it. It's good to see that you're actually, you know, taking up this and working.
So that clip went viral because, and this is a good news story about social media, you can reach a bigger audience through a metaphor, which is this tiny little poem of a documentary, than I did with the feature film, okay? That's 2.4 million Australian voters who were able to slightly maybe change their mind about Hanson if they were supportive of her before. So, what was the outcome? So it goes to the top defamation lawyer in Sydney, Saturday night, we're about to go to air the next day, do we have to pull the clip? The defamation lawyer came back and said, Hanson and Ashby are right. The clip is defamatory. Pauline Hanson has defamed herself. Keep it in. So we went to air.
Well, Pauline Hanson, of course, in this last election, her slogan was something like, we have the guts to say what you're thinking. Is that true? Is that true? I mean, are a lot of Australians deeply racist?
I think she's dog whistling.
Yeah.
And I think what's happened is the whole discourse has moved in an era of propaganda on steroids, where all sorts of political interests are using propaganda techniques to change the way we think and feel. It has moved into this primitive world that Freud actually first identified, which is a world where if you can get underneath any human being, you will find deeply primal, sexual and aggressive instincts that, if they're not controlled, can erode the whole of society. And that is what propagandists have capitalised on. It is also what Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, capitalised on when he decided to use propaganda techniques in the time of peace to manipulate Americans through public relations, he rebranded it as public relations, into buying products from mass-producing companies, like selling tobacco to women. So, yeah, I mean, sorry, I can't even remember what the question was. She's dog whistling. She's dog whistling. So she's playing to our base instincts.
Yep.
And it was not always thus. Cast your mind back to just before 9/11. We had a much higher standard, a much more graceful standard of public discourse across the world before 9/11.
Okay.
It's inconceivable where we are now compared to that.
Okay, so just recently I heard Channel 9 is negotiating with Pauline Hanson to give her a regular slot on their very badly rating morning program. That's the media again.
But she's always had that slot. I mean,
she's had it at Channel 7 and now Channel 9 is negotiating.
Sure, but she always had a slot on Channel 9 as well. Like when I was following her running the election, the other reason she got in, and once again the literati in Canberra didn't pick up on this, is that Australians, ordinary Australians, were watching her on Channel 7 and Channel 9 while they ate their Kellogg's in the morning.
She's right. I think she's right.
Having an absolute platform for her divisive views, cynically used by Channel 7 and Channel 9 more irregularly because they knew that she rated. And that's part of this whole truth has jumped the shark, it is just a commodity now. They put her on cynically because it didn't matter if she divided audiences or not, she got shared and passed on. That's totally changed the way politics is talked about.
Okay,
right?
You mentioned politics before 9/11 and politics after. What about Australian politics before Pauline Hanson? And then the co-opting of Pauline Hanson by the Conservatives for her policies and post that.
Yes.
So what has she done? She's completely transformed this country.
She has, and I mean, I agree with, I think it was Margot who said it, if Pauline Hanson hadn't existed, John Howard would have had to invent her. So my line on Pauline, having made this film and written this book about her, and incidentally, I kind of couldn't help but like her making the film, because you'd know this, when you film someone, whether or not you agree with them, you feel sort of protective, you know. When I wrote the book, I totally fell out of love with her completely. I mean, I've never supported what she believes in, but I don't like her anymore either. But if the bottom line is, Hanson's never changed, Australia has. And I'll just give you a visual thing to keep in your mind. Please remember, and I'm sure many of you can, when Hanson stood up in the near-empty House of Reps in 1996 to give her maiden speech, and politicians on both sides of Parliament were at pains to not be there. And there was just one senator like this and one on the other side, and she stood up and said, "We're being swamped by Asians." And also, I'm, you know, just because I was born here and I have as much right to being Australian as anyone who claims they've got an Indigenous blood, and all these shocking things. That was shocking at the time. That was so shocking that the media were having debates about, do we give it any oxygen or do we ignore it? And the Sydney Morning Herald at the time made the decision to bury it on page 8 with an announcement about Bob Brown's maiden speech, which happened at the same time. Now fast forward to 2016, exactly 20 years later, and there is Hanson in her Star Trek suit in the Senate saying, I believe we are being swamped by Muslims. Look at the conga line of politicians on both sides, Labour and Liberal, lining up to hug her and congratulate her. That is how we've changed from a civilised, pro-multicultural, left-leaning, mainstream, humanitarian discourse that is about the commonwealth as opposed to me first profiteering, and this nation of petty-minded accountants that Howard has turned us into, apathetic bias silos. And Hanson's absolutely part of that, but to be honest, she's not intelligent enough to blame. I blame Howard for where we've ended up. And people far more articulate than me have talked about this. Marcia Langton's one of them. The loss of decency in our country, the selling off of the commonwealth. Hanson's catch cry is, it's not fair. She was brought up in a burger shop. She was taught the value of hard work and paying for your board by a hard-working, working-class family in Brisbane. So she grew up feeling that if she could pull herself up by the bootstraps as a single mum of 4 with 2 abusive husbands and become what she is now, which is a property millionairess, why does anyone else deserve a handout? So it's that mentality that she's preyed on. And incidentally, you talked about this before, it's actually many of her supporters are on welfare and have been for generations. So go figure. What are the prejudices there that are being played on? And Trump has done the same.
That's right, because they're aspirational and they want to have property as well, like she did.